right. Good morning, everybody. Another episode of the Fireside Chat, and I have the pleasure of having Roslyn Santolina joining us from Clari. She's the head of operations. And Roslyn and I have been in touch since the days, I think you were at DataStax, or even before that.
I think even before
Signified,
that.
I think.
That's Signified. Yep,
Signified,
that's right.
and then DataStax and all. And so I think we've been sort of comparing notes on sales strategy and operations. So it's really good to have you here. Roslyn, do you want to give a little bit of background on, what do you do and things that make you passionate about sales operations and strategy?
Yeah, definitely. So let's see, I've been doing really managing operations for like almost, I guess it's been 20 years now, not to give away how old I am, but it has been quite some time. And I really enjoy the operations aspect and the strategy aspect because you're sort of, I'm not necessarily a salesperson, but kind of being behind the scenes and really enabling, systems, processes, policy, all of the infrastructure that makes the engine run. And that's sort of where I'm, where my passion is.
Excellent. So, we talked about forecasting, and like one of the things that's really interesting for me as forecasting is, so we are a planning platform, right? And we got all kinds of customers building the go-to-market plans. Every single customer of ours will ask us, "So, do you guys do forecasting?" And I will like, "No, we don't do forecasting," and it's always kind of surprised me, like, why is forecasting so hard, right? And like people always, this is, I mean, it's been around for years. Everybody thinks about forecasting, but for most places I've seen, it's like a toss of a coin. You get it right 50% of the time. Half the time you just like shrink away. So what do you think makes it hard for people?
Yeah, and it's interesting because everyone, like you said, everyone does forecasting, right? Yeah. You would think that it would be, a really refined process by now. But I think forecasting is hard because, you're trying to really predict the future, right? Nobody has sort of a crystal ball, right? You're processing a number of different variables. Some are data-driven. Some are just judgment, to predict an outcome. And some of it is kind of behavioral because, your customer is also making a decision, probably based on a combination of, data and emotion. So the number of variables that you're trying to juggle, right? You're obviously juggling dollars, but also timing. Then there's a number of other factors, that are sort of unique to your business. Maybe it's the product mix, the units, licenses if you're subscription based, maybe it's boxes if you're in a hardware business, and then all the commercial terms. So it's all the things, you're juggling all the things that have to get done and really finalized before an agreement can even get signed.
Okay. So, you spoke about a bunch of things over there, but of course, there's a tools piece, there's the human behavior aspect, which people kind of underplay. Bala and I have this joke that when we were at Salesforce, we used to have these $1 million deals that needed executive review, and none of the sales guys wanted the execs to review, so they'll all keep it at $900K or something around that, and magically it pops up, and all forecasting goes ahead. So people will play games, right? So yes, you have those tools, and people will still play games. So what are the kind of steps do you recommend that you've seen in your life that actually work, that make it easier, right?
Yep.
Managers are held accountable all the time, right? So everybody's got to do this. But like, how do we make their life easier?
Right. So your objective is really to remove as much of that subjectivity as possible, right? You can't predict how a customer is going to behave or respond, but you can predict sort of the likelihood of, your forecast based upon, very clear milestones that happen in your business, because how long it takes, right? How long it'll take to get something through your process. And then it's your job to figure out kind of how long it will take to get it through the customers. So kind of from a practical perspective, as you mentioned about, sort of how do you get your sales team and your managers, all aligned and kind of following that rigor, is one of the things I've been really surprised about is, just having clear stages, right, along your forecast process. Every company I've gone into, a lot of times you'll ask kind of, did you have stages? And yes, they have stages, but does everyone understand what what's happening in each stage. Usually it's kind of, a little bit of a confused face, and sometimes they go, oh, kind of, So I think there's a couple of things is, you've got to have clear stages, the definitions, what's the exit criteria, what questions have to be answered before you move from one stage to another. Along the same lines, you've got to have clear forecast categories. Same thing, right? Every company defines sort of what's in commit or what's an upside, or maybe they call it most likely, or they have all these different terms. But from a process perspective, you've got to have very clear forecast categories. So everyone is aligned, knows that if something is committed, what exactly does that mean for the business? You've also got to have a defined process for how to reflect the dollars, because almost in every scenario, you're going to have sort of a likely dollars, like you think what you're going to close, and then there's going to be some upside potential, right? A customer may say, I'm only going to roll it out to, my SDRs, and that's a set amount if it's a license based. And then you might be able to have some upside around selling to an AE. So to really, kind of dive into your forecast is really, you need to have both, right? You need to see the likely dollars, but also be able to reflect that upside potential. I also think once you have all of those things defined, you have a process, you've got to have consistent application, right, across all the teams. Everyone needs to be on the same page around definitions. Everyone knows what it means if something's in a certain stage or a certain forecast category. And then you build that operational cadence, right? So you have that operational cadence around when you review what and kind of that timing, and you define it, and then you follow it. And then there's sort of rigor, right, around the pipeline inspection. So during those forecast calls or forecast reviews, when you're going through, the information, there's rigor, right? You're diving deep into the deals, really understanding based upon what you know about the business. And then you sort of kind of rinse and repeat, right? Because then you have this process, and it's iterative. So you just iterate, you keep putting back your learnings kind of back into the process, and, it gets refined over time. And I think as the business, evolves, you're going to find you're going to learn things about accuracy, whether or not things are working for your business. Then you kind of bring those back into the process, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So no, that makes sense. There's a couple of things over there that would dive in is process, right? So there is definitely the process aspect of figuring out, making sure that everybody understands what a given stage means, what the exit criteria are, right? Yet most companies fail to enforce them consistently. So there's definitely the aspect of taking that process and making it enforceable, right? In some ways. What have you seen in your experience that has worked really well? And sometimes where, like salespeople are really smart people, actually, they'll game the system, right? So you tell them the rules, they'll play the games. So how do you sort of institutionalize that process? And especially, like your Clari right now, right? It's a growing company. You will have new people coming in all the time. You also have older reps who've been around the block for a while at Clari. So do you see that? Is it an enablement function, or is it a sales managers managing to the cadence, or like how do you enforce that process consistently across the org with a combination of new blood and old like people in the mix?
Yep, definitely. So I think it all goes back to having a really well defined process, and then the training. And that can be enablement if you have it. It can be ops. In the old days we didn't really have enablement, right? Sales ops managed all of the training as well. But it's really making sure you define the process. You're continuing to communicate it. You're making sure people are up to speed. You're training, and then it's sort of that repeat cycle, right? Managers need to buy into it, and then you need to sort of enforce it within your operating cadence, and just make sure that everyone's looking at it, right? You're following the steps. People are looking at it to make sure that it's getting done, and you've got to make it easy. Right. I think that's one of the things that from an ops perspective, you should constantly be looking for is how do I make this easy and simple for the rep? Right. We talk a lot about it, but I think a lot of folks kind of start to make things very complex. And you just got to strip it down and make it as simple as possible. Because to your point, they're not going to follow the process if it's complex. Right.
Yeah. I mean, exactly. If they're like, I want to sell, I'm not here to just build a forecasting piece. Exactly. Anything that gets in the way, they'll not do it.
Exactly. So you've got to make it easy, make it simple, less clicks, the less clicks, the better. And then you also have to show the value, right? I think that's the biggest piece is if you do A, B, and C, here's the value to you, right? It's not just inputting data so somebody can go look at a spreadsheet, but it's inputting data that's going to now be actionable, right? That we're actually going to be able to use to help build strategy and help you close deals faster.
Yeah. So two things on that. One is on this notion of making it, there's something in it for them. Do you see incentive comp as a lever that, the closer to your forecast accuracy, the better for you in terms of your commissions? Or I'm going to penalize you, even if you make a number, but I'm still going to penalize you if your forecast accuracy historically has been off, right? So you're sandbagging, but, or you're over, either way, right? It's a bad thing. So that, and then secondly, part of that question is, you mentioned about the cadence, the operational cadence. And most managers will focus on the pipeline review cadence. And sometimes, at least I've seen them trying to do forecasting and pipeline review all in the same call. Does that work, or should that be separate?
Yeah, so I've done it both ways. I think it depends a lot on the size of your company and the amount of your pipe, right? Depending on how many deals you have, because a forecast call should really be looking at your overall number in terms of how you're tracking against your plan. And then you're looking at where the gaps are and how you're going to get to plan. The deal strategy side, from my point of view, or the pipeline review that you're kind of referencing, I see sort of when you say pipeline review, there's the forecast piece of it that you're reviewing your pipeline that makes up your forecast. But then there's also kind of the deal strategy side of it, right? Where you're actually, you're working on the deals, you're trying to understand where they're sitting in the stages, and then you're trying to understand, what do I need to do to move the deal forward? So in a smaller company, I think if you're only looking at a handful of deals, oftentimes that becomes one call, right? But in a larger company, it's quite different just because of the volume and the amount of people involved as well.
Okay. And so then on the incentive side, do you see incentive comp being a tool that in your arsenal in the ops that you're using?
So no. So I have used a forecast accuracy as a lever in the past, but more at a higher level, kind of like general manager, VP level, right? Because they're kind of overall, have responsibility. At a rep level, I know in many situations we've talked about that, but I think because of sort of some of the underlying issues around the operational pieces of it, the process, the tools, the things that we've kind of talked about around policies, stages, et cetera. I think if those are in place, well, I guess I should say, if those are not in place, then oftentimes it's not really the salesperson's fault per se, whether or not the numbers are coming out the way you're expecting. But at the same time, if they are in place, it shouldn't be an issue.
Okay. So what you're saying is, yes, incentive comp works, but not on the rep. Don't mess with the rep. Keep it to the managers and the leadership over there, because they are essentially driving the forecast call, and it's their job to make sure there's forecast accuracy.
Well, I think there's responsibility and accountability at every level for accurate forecast. I think from a rep's perspective, being accurate in your forecast and being able to understand how close you are to hitting your target or whether or not you're going to hit your target, I think that should be enough incentive for a rep to ensure that their pipeline is accurate, right?
Fair enough. So one of the things that, and this goes back to how we get dragged into the forecasting discussion, right? Like, why are you guys not doing forecasting? Is because we're on the planning side of the house, right? So we do segmentation, and how do we automate segmentation? How do we automate and manage coverages, right? How do you? It'll be interesting to get your thoughts as an ops person, how you think about segmentation, coverage, ramp, all those things, right? Even the quota setting process itself, right? Impacting the ability to forecast. Right?
Yeah. So, I think if I look at it, I think of the forecast is sort of your starting point, and it will enable you to do a lot of things that you mentioned, right? Because if you have sort of a good forecast, you have forecast accuracy, right, then everything is going to be, how should I say this? I guess the more accurate your forecast is, the more predictable your business can be, right? Which leads you to confidence in your operating plan, right? So as you're planning, my forecast is accurate, or I have confidence in it, and I can build out my operating plan based on what I'm seeing in the pipeline, right? It also gives you confidence in your ability to hit your targets, meet your goals, as well as, being comfortable spending money because you know that your forecast is strong. And then when you start to kind of dive down deeper into the details, if you're able to forecast properly, then you can determine where you should invest, right? And you talked about segment, which markets you should invest in, which geos you want to go into. That will help you kind of determine where you want to invest, what your coverage model should look like, from a headcount perspective, as well as from a quota perspective. So I think it really starts there, because having confidence in the numbers that you're going to bring in allows you to start doing all of that planning, right? And feeling confident in it.
Yeah, I mean, sales is an investment, right? So if you're able to have a good forecast, then you can invest in hiring and doing all the things. So exactly. I think all those things are linked. That's why people are going to ask us, and we steer clear from it, because we want to focus on the plan side. But yes, how do I segment depends on my forecast. How do I set a coverage model depends on my ability to forecast. That'll tell me how many resources do I have. My ramp impacts my ability to forecast, right? And so all those things come together. So the thing that is interesting is there is definitely, Clari is a tools company. It's providing the tool for the ability for managers to get forecast. Right. We've talked a lot about the process side of the house, right? How do you balance the tools and the process piece, right? The reason I asked that question, a lot of companies that I've spoken to, they love Clari, the tool. But at the same time, they'll say, I don't trust the number because, I don't know what people are putting over there. So it's only as good as the number that's coming in from the system. So how do you balance the tool and the process piece together?
Yep. So I guess, as you mentioned, the tool is only as good as, what you put into it, right? A lot of times you'll hear folks saying, oh, once I implement the system, I'm going to fix my, X process, my forecasting process, my comp process, et cetera. But the system is going to do what you design it to do, right? So it's going to help do that. But it's really, the data that you put into it, the processes that you have around how you use the tool, right? The policies, as we mentioned earlier, really the adoption by the team. If people aren't using it, it's not going to be effective. There's the governance, right? Enforcing the process, and then making sure that the tool is bringing visibility and, I guess, value to the team. So in terms of sort of, when you do use a tool or a system, you've got to, I guess the net of it is that, you're bringing in a tool and you're balancing sort of the process, because you want to take out as much of the subjectivity that we kind of talked about in predicting your forecast out of your process as possible. So, of course, it's going to be impossible to not have some element of subjectivity, because there's a human aspect, right, to both your team's forecast as well as the customers. But the better, your processes are, the better your tools are, and better, or I guess I should say, the better your processes are, the better your tools are that are aligned to support those processes, the more decisions you can make based on data versus, intuition or sort of your feelings. And then with that right structure in place, then that remaining feeling part, that there will always be some of that, can be sort of analyzed and inspected, during your one-on-ones or during your reviews with the sales team.
So as companies have scaled, you've worked with, startup companies like Senderso, and then you've worked with more mature companies as well.
Yeah.
How have you seen the process evolve? Right? What's the difference between, companies that are doing it at scale the right way versus startups that have no data, right? They're like, I don't know what the data is. I'm going to make this as I go along, right? And so part of it is, in my mind, comes through operational agility, like how fast can you, like you said, get the input from the field and update. But what have you seen that have you seen the process A be very drastically different between scales, and B, if it is different, like what are the things that growing company would do differently?
Yeah, it's interesting that even as a large company, there's also challenges around forecasting. I think forecasting is just quite challenging for everyone, which is probably one of the reasons you mentioned, like, oh, we're not doing forecasting. We're going to kind of stay in the planning space. I think forecasting, as a business grows, things become more complex, right? You have more transactions, you have more variables to consider. There's more people involved, and it's likely that your product mix might be more complex, and even your sales motion, right? Because you might be leveraging partners, you might be selling through a channel. So there's a number of other variables in the process in a larger company or a larger business, and even a small business as they start to scale, right? So the good news is that, I guess, as you grow, you're less likely to be at least dependent upon, a handful of deals to make your number. So there's a little bit less volatility in your number, sort of at the highest level. But because there's more complexities as you start to scale, and in a bigger company, there's more variables, there's more complexities. So I find like it's really important to establish that process and rigor in forecasting early, right? So when you're still small, make sure you build the right foundation to be able to scale, and then make sure you're, continuing to review and revamp, as needed, right? Because you'll learn from your process whether or not you're hitting the right accuracy targets and you're doing the right things. So it's really important to continue to inspect and continuing to iterate.
Yeah, so that's I think it's an important aspect which is brought up, is it's not a one and done thing. Once
That's
you
right.
put the process together, you got to iterate, you got to take feedback from the field and continue to sort of iterate assumptions around things like how long it takes for a person to ramp,
Yeah.
coverage models, all those things. And kind of so essentially, do not think of forecasting as just a set of activities based on, oh, this was the stage, this is my exit criteria, but essentially it's a feedback. That's the end result of all the feedback that comes through. Are we doing setting quotas the right way? Are we setting the coverages the right way? And all those things, right? Because like one of the things that is scary and interesting is both ways, is attainment numbers for most companies right now in the 50% ranges, right? Which means you're hiring more people, almost double the number of people in a sales team than you actually need, right? So if your forecast accuracy can be better, attainment numbers could probably be better, right? And we can all run a much leaner sales team, right? So the forecast process piece is what you're saying is got to be iterative, got to keep scaling, got to factor in multiple product mixes and all those things. So, what should a Series A, Series B company be looking forward to in a forecasting process? Is it basically just for make sure that the CRM system is set up right and everybody's got the same alignment on stages and exit criteria? Are those the two things?
No, I mean, I think it's probably very different in an early stage company, as you know, having done it before. You're probably not going to care so much about a lot of that process, right? You're going to be just like focused on, let me just push this deal through, because you're probably managing a dozen deals, which is, maybe just a handful of deals a month or less even potentially. So I think the lack of having those kind of process and criteria is probably not as important, right? It's not as critical because you have one or two people, maybe there's 10 people in the company and everyone knows what's happening with every deal, right? And it's likely that they're all involved. So I think it's less important then, but as you start to scale, and I think as you start to bring in sales reps, right? When your CEO is no longer your primary salesperson, and either is your CRO or your head of sales, and you start to bring in even your first salesperson, I think you've got to start building that rigor, right? Because then as you start to hire and potentially, hit sort of a high growth stage, you're not trying to now rapidly kind of build the train, build the tracks as the train's going 100 miles an hour. And I've seen that quite a bit, right? In a lot of Series C type companies, you're at that point where you're taking off, but you don't have the infrastructure to support it, because you're sort of doing this startup stage where you've got a couple of reps, right? Now, all of a sudden, you bring in your ops person, and this ops person comes in and has to now go do a lot of, rebuild, right? You're tearing down things, you're rebuilding, and then you're retraining all of the salespeople at the same time as you're ramping new new hires as well. And so to the extent that you can sort of get in front of that, then when your new hires come on board, you've got a comprehensive, onboarding plan. They know what to expect. And then you're sort of off and running.
So what kind of infrastructure would you start putting together, right? Like to build that forecasting process, right? Because like what I've heard from most people is, oh, it's great, but my data is really crappy. I need to go fix data. Like, I really don't know, like, where do we want to start with that one, right? So what are the kind of infrastructure that you would recommend companies should put together to build a robust forecasting process?
Yeah, I think, I think too many companies, I mean, this is just my opinion, but I think a lot of companies think that they bring in a CRM and they think it's going to it's going to build their whole sales process, right? I'm going to get, a Salesforce or a Microsoft Dynamics or whatever tool. And now I have when I install it and go live, I have a sales process. And that's just not how it works, right? And oftentimes I've seen going into a company, they say, oh, we have Salesforce. It's like, oh, great. But you go to Salesforce and nothing is built. Nobody's using it. Nobody's actually, going in and putting anything in there until they're actually closing a deal. So I think it's more important that you build sort of that infrastructure, and whatever you're using, whether it's a system or it's a spreadsheet, as long as that you start to build a repeatable process. I talk a lot about process because to me, I think from an ops perspective, process and policy is like everything, right? Systems and tools is a big part of it as well. But unless you have a repeatable process, it's going to be sort of just chaos everywhere, right? Data and process. I think those are the biggest things, right? And if you have a process and some policy around it, then you can start getting data quality too, right? Because then people know what to expect, what they're supposed to input, what data is relevant, and what data we're looking at, right? Because then you kind of have those things defined where everybody's on the same page. So, I mean, regardless of whether it's in a spreadsheet or it's in a full-blown tool, it's still only as good as your data and your process.
So on the process side, people have different methodologies. And so what you're saying is, no matter what methodology you pick, stick with it and define those exit criteria as relevant to that methodology and make it consistent.
Yeah, because every company is different, right? I think your business is going to be different. So, the process by which you close a deal is going to be different, right? The milestones, the interaction with the customer, it can be all different flavors, but sort of the underlying is there are certain steps that need to happen in order for you to close a deal. And the sooner you can identify those steps and start to monitor those steps, the sooner your forecast is going to be more predictable.
Okay. Are there any metrics that you think about when you think about forecasting?
Oh, tons of metrics. Yeah, there's tons of metrics around, I think a lot about, obviously accuracy is big, but what you're really looking for is, at the highest level, you're looking at, obviously your forecast to plan, right? How are you tracking against your targets? That's sort of the base level is looking at, how are you tracking against your quota or your target? And then what's your pipeline coverage, right? What is your coverage in terms of what can move forward? Then you start getting into a lot more of the detailed forecast analytics, because then you need to start looking at, deals as they move through the funnel, what's in various stages. You start to look at, all of the average deal size, and you look at the average time in stage and, the average deal cycle. So there's, so many different metrics to look at to help you be better prepared to sort of understand and predict your revenue stream. And I think, you mentioned, obviously coming from Clari, I mean, having the visibility at your fingertips, sort of real time, of all of these different pieces that can, help move the needle on a deal is huge, right? Because the data is huge.
Yeah. So going back to your Clari days now, like for example, Clari, is a Series C company growing up. How much weightage do you give to historical forecasting to build your future model, right? It's a growing company, like you said earlier, right? When you're building a company, you don't know what you don't know, right?
Right.
One or two guys, everybody kind of, it's more of a, I would say intuitive forecasting than anything else, right? We all have a gut level thing. I think we can close this because nobody's actually capturing any data.
Right.
So how much, so when you're starting, is there a emphasis on looking at historical numbers and trying to forecast what the future holds? Or we kind of like, you know what, history doesn't count anywhere, and let's look at all these multi-variable things that you talked about, like length of sales forecasting and all the other things, that other variables, right? What do you recommend?
No, I think a history is absolutely critical to look at how not only a deal behaves, but how a rep behaves, right? Because there is that sort of human aspect of it, as you mentioned. So looking at the history that's how you're going to be able to better define your process, right? Because then you have sort of what you think the process looks like, what needs to happen, sort of the steps that need to happen before a deal will close. But then as you learn and kind of look through your history, you realize, oh, for these type of, customers, it's this path. If for, this type of product, it's kind of this path. It's just, I guess at a very high level, very simplistically thinking, if you just think about segmentation, right, around commercial versus enterprise, and selling into those spaces, right, that they're very different models. And, the sales cycle is very different, the time to close, the people that need to be involved, right, the decision makers, it's all different. So having, using that sort of information and watching how it's historically trended in your business and kind of that feedback loop that we were talking about in terms of bringing that back into your process, right? And being able to, really, I think one of the things, that ops is really responsible for too is analyzing the wins, right? Understanding what wins, what moves the needle, right? What drives the deals to go through the funnel faster, and being able to replicate that and being able to share that and train other reps to be able to follow that path. I think it's definitely ongoing learning. And you've got to look at your history to know kind of, you've got to look at where you came from, right? To figure out where you're going.
I think that's great. And I think you hit the nail again on the head, going back that before you think about tools, think process wins. And if you are, as you continue to grow, you will have, better lens on, say, your product lines and your segments. And each of those segments may have different sales motions. And your stages need to reflect that. So you can't have one opportunity record time for all of Salesforce, for all your customers, because essentially each segment has a different stage, different exit criteria, and different thresholds. And so companies need to really think about the segmentation model and how they're forecasting for each segmentation model. Correct?
Yep. And even though the stages could be very similar, and sort of what happens in the stage, kind of the big milestones, can be very similar within, different segments or even different geographies, but sort of the timing of how long it takes to maybe get something done within a stage is obviously going to be different.
Be different. Yeah. No, I think absolutely, this is great. So segmentation is one. Depending on segmentation, you'll have people, coverage models will change as well, and so the number of people involved from your side, your team, touching the customers will also give you some historical thing with it, whether it's a new deal or renewal or upsell, forecasting insight over there. So process is one thing that is not static. Process is continuing to evolve. So as an ops person, you have a plane that is flying, and people are used to a process. They have stages and all those things. How do you manage to keep those processes agile and alive, right? While the sales motion is still going on, right? So like taking the feedback and making sure that feedback is reflected in the process.
Yeah, I think, especially working in a startup or a high growth type company, the ability to be flexible, be very nimble is huge, right? We talk about it a lot, especially with the current environment, with COVID-19 hitting. Your ability to pivot quickly internally and be able to support the rapid changes that are happening is a huge differentiator, right? Between from one company to another. So I think, you're constantly learning, but your ability to sort of, as you redefine, maybe it's a stage, maybe it's how we're doing forecasting, whatever process, no matter how small or how large, making sure that it's super clear, it's super simple, and you roll it out in a way that is easy to digest for the reps, and just make it as easy as possible. One thing I've learned kind of working with sales for so many years is if you don't make it simple, they're not going to do it, right? They're going to find a way around it. So you want to make it simple, and you want to make it, valuable to them. So as, every company I've gone into, we've revamped the stages after I've joined, because a lot of times we're looking at it and it's kind of the same, same sort of questions around forecast. It's like, well, how good are we doing forecasting? And for most companies, it's, maybe it's going really well, but there's always room for improvement, right? Because you're constantly learning. So, the smaller the sales team, the easier it is to roll out change, right? If you only have 20 sellers, it's a lot easier. Even if you had to do, broader training and then one-on-ones with everyone, you could, right? And walk through it. In a bigger company, it's more of a rollout. It's more of a train the trainer, right? You're training everybody, but then you're really training your management team to make sure that they're enforcing it amongst their team.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I think like in every conversation that we go in, and we'll say we can do planning, and they'll say planning is great, but data is broken, and we thought, well, the data is broken, and invariably they're like, okay, making a decision. Well, our go-to-market has evolved, our processes have evolved, and as such, Salesforce is not kept up in sync, or we got all this, custom code that we built up, and I'm going to mute my Salesforce and start again. I'm like, this will not change, because you will revisit this movie 5 years from now again, right? So, any best practices, thoughts on sort of, like what is your decision point of saying, I want to start fresh on a new instance of Salesforce, or I have the patience to sort of redo this thing all over again?
Yeah, so I think, it's funny, I laugh because there have been many times, not at Clari, of course. Clari actually is, surprisingly, we are really well run, right? And I think from the outside looking in, that, and it's true. I was surprising, just really happy when I came on board to kind of see some of the process and systems that we have built out. And our forecasting process obviously is like top notch. I was super impressed by how we use Clari for Clari, because being a two-time customer of Clari, my Clari never looked like our Clari. So that's one of the things I'm super excited about, is just kind of sharing, continuing to learn myself, and then being able to share a lot of that with other, ops leaders on how best to use. But I think, kind of, there's been many times in my past life when I wish I could just, move everything to a sandbox and then clear it, hit refresh and just go back to kind of a reset button. Because, kind of going back to your question about Series A, do they just implement a CRM? I think a lot of companies do that. And then the data becomes just really dirty. Everybody is an admin. They create multiple fields that they never use again. There's no governance around the system. Mm-hmm. So then when the ops person comes in, later on in the cycle, and a lot of companies, I think, hire too late. They hire an ops person too late to help manage some of this. Then, your first couple of months is spent cleaning the data, kind of, restricting access to different things so that you can sort of start to, stop the bleeding and then start to define process and start to clean up. But the data element is huge. I think every company, if we were to poll, 100 ops people, they'll probably tell you their data is not great, right? Yeah. I mean, there'll be a handful that are, but I think, without good data, as there's nothing.
Yeah, I mean, we get pulled into so many of these data discussions. I mean, like, what is it that you're trying to achieve? What behavior? Because essentially it's a policy piece, right? Yes, we know how to scale it and automate a lot of those policies without having to write custom code. But irrespective of whether you write custom code or you take automation, you still have to spend the time defining those policies and figuring it out from there.
Yep, and clean the data, right? That's, so many times I've implemented so many different systems kind of in my my lifetime or my career. And every time it's like you want to implement a new system, but you've got to clean up the data. Right.
And nobody wants to do that.
Nobody wants to do that part.
It's thankless, but it has to be done.
It has to be done, especially in having, when you implement a new tool, it's the perfect time, right? Because it's a force function to say, I've got to clean data. I want good data to go into my new, whatever that system is.
Yeah. So I think, we were like one of our customers, we are working with them and they're running the planning platform. And one of the things that they said within the first month on the planning, when they're seeing the segmentation, they're seeing the territory breakdown and all, they're like, oh, I can already start seeing the gaps in my processes because we want to segment in this way, right? And so whether you take a name like employee field, for example, right? And then suddenly realize, yeah, you can segment, but 80% of your customers' accounts do not have an employee field, right?
Exactly.
And so either we get the data or some of the data to sort of figure out whether I have that information or I'm stuck, right? So like at least shedding the gap on those kind of issues, right? And so I think this has been a great conversation. I want to thank you, but I think we want to recap, right, a few things here. As you think of forecasting, it cannot be thought of in silos. It is a process first. Tools are an enabler to help you forecast better. It does not live in a silo, right? How you segment, how you set coverage, how you set up quotas, all those things impact your ability to forecast, and vice versa. They feed into each other, which means it's a living process. And if it's a living process, it's only as good as the underlying data that you have in your systems. And so you got to really invest the time in not just thinking of the forecasting process, but also data governance process. Like you said, right? Enterprise data governance processes have to work hand in hand to make your forecast process really work.
That's right.
Does that capture it?
Yep, absolutely.
No,
That's
I think
great.
Yeah, thank you. And no, it's great. I think this will be very helpful. And I'll look forward to sort of talking to you more on sales ops and a few other topics that I have.
Definitely. Sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.